we're drinking is a very rare beast indeed. It didn't exist, well, it existed for a long time, but then it disappeared in the 1950s and it only made its reappearance in 2012. It's one of the Mitchell Spot whiskies. Mitchell's they were originally a tea and coffee blender and importer in Dublin, and they also started buying whiskey from the Jameson's distillery and aging it and bottling it themselves. They were whiskey bonders, as it was called, and eventually they even went into wine. They had bought wine from all over the world, and what they would do is they would use those wine barrels to age the whiskey in, to give it a little bit different. Normally the most popular or the most common of the spot whiskies is Green Spot. Green Spot's sort of aged between 7 and 10 years, and it tends to be aged in bourbon and sherry casks. The Red Spot is 15 years old. It tends to be aged in, well, it is aged in bourbon, sherry and port casks, and the Blue Spot is aged in Madeira casks. But the Yellow Spot, which has come back on the market thankfully, absolutely wonderful whiskey. It has won countless awards. It's a pure pot still whiskey, which means it's from a single distillery, from a single pot still in that distillery, the distillery being the old Midleton distillery in West Cork. It is then aged partly in, and when I say partly, I mean they take a portion of the whiskey and they age it entirely in bourbon casks. They take another portion of the whiskey and they age it entirely in sherry casks. And the last thing they do with the last third of the whiskey is they age it in Malaga casks. Now Malaga, for those of you who don't know, is in the south of Spain. Its wines are not entirely collectible, perhaps. They're great wines to drink on holiday. They tend to be made from Pedro Jimenez grapes and Moscatel, so Muscat of Alexandria grapes. So consequently, they tend to be sweeter, and that comes through in this whiskey. This is got a barrel of flavour in it. It really is. It's a magnificent. Oh, it's beautiful. It's got everything on the nose. It's got little bits of fruit, red apple rather than green apple. It's got a nice sort of slightly smoked caramel, salty smoked caramel kind of character to it, and barley sweetness.
How much is that one?
That one is, in New Zealand terms, that is $175 a bottle. So it's about, I think it's about $120, $110 US. Well, that's the global average price. The Mitchells are also an interesting family. They were, unlike most of the big families in Irish whiskey, the early big families like Jameson and Powers, they were not, I'm trying to come up with a diplomatic way of putting this. They were not Scottish, and they were not in favour of union with England. Indeed, one of the Mitchells, John Mitchell and John Francis, one of them, was involved in an abortive attempt to overthrow British rule in Ireland in 1803. You know, as you do. We used to have the odd rebellion every 10 or 15 years. The Emmet Rebellion, which he was part of, was particularly crap. They, whereby 200 people tried to storm Dublin Castle, and most of them were arrested by the time they got there, because not for sedition or for rebellion, but because they were drunk and disorderly. But yet it's gone down in history, because of course it has. It's Ireland versus England, so of course it goes down in history. But yeah, so it's, in a way, if you want to put it in the crudest possible terms, whereas Jameson and Powers tended to be Protestant whiskies, this is very much a Catholic whiskey. Whether that makes any difference, I don't think it does. But the whiskey itself is a magnificent beast. These are generally, if you can ever get hold of any of the spot whiskies, so Green Spot, Yellow Spot, Red Spot, Blue Spot, take your chance, get them while they can. They don't make a lot of them, and they're absolutely magnificent, and they're what Irish whiskey used to taste like 200 years ago.